Alexander-Michael Hadjilyra is a researcher scholar specializing on the Armenian Cypriot community of Cyprus, having researched it since 2008. And he's written dozens of articles, books, participated in documentaries, and he's been so kind to accept my invitation today to discuss this minority that has existed in Cyprus for centuries. Thank you, Alexander, for coming onto the show. The the first question, I suppose, which in my experience is never really an easy one, because when you talk about identity, with that being said, sometimes it's really hard to identify what that means. And so, how would Armenians define themselves, or what does it mean to be Armenian?
Armenians are Armenians by blood, but also religion plays an important part, language as well. I mean, in Cyprus, Cyprus is one of the few communities of the diaspora that have kept the Armenian language um, instead of, adopting the language of the land. So to be Armenian is a multitude of things, but then again, don't forget that we've got uh, somebody who is half Armenian or a quarter Armenian, or even further than that, less than that. So it's a variety of factors.
And so, what is, at the intro here, we mentioned a religious and ethnic identity, an ethnic community in Cyprus. What is technically their legal status? I mean, how are they recognized in the Constitution?
Now, the Constitution of Cyprus recognizes two communities, which is the Greek Cypriot community and the Turkish Cypriot community, as well as three religious groups. The religious groups are not named explicitly in the Constitution, but they're explained in law, and that is the Armenians, the Maronites, and the Latins. And the reason for them called religious groups is because when Turkey was involved in forming the constitution, it would not consent to having the Turkish Cypriots called a minority. So the Turkish Cypriots got an upgrade to community, and as a result, and after much many negotiations and debates and deliberations and so on, it was finally agreed that the three small native minorities would be called religious groups. So, but then again, don't forget that even though they're officially called religious groups, there is very much an ethnic background into this term.
Can we quantify how many Armenians there are in Cyprus today?
I would say about 4,000, of whom 2,500 are Cypriots, and the rest they are from Armenia, the Middle East, and other places.
My understanding is, obviously there's more recent Armenian community in Cyprus and a more historic one. Is it easy? In other words, is there a continuity between the Armenian community that has existed in Cyprus, since 1600s, 1700s, as opposed to the ones that may have emigrated to Cyprus in the 20th century?
Well, now, first of all, let's just say that the first Armenians in Cyprus arrived, for sure that we know, in the year 578. But when the Ottoman Turks took over Cyprus, which was in 1570 to 1571, the Armenians who were in Cyprus during the Ottoman times did not have any connection to the Armenians that were before them. At least that's what we know. Coming now to those who migrated to Cyprus during genocide, not just during the genocide, they started with the Hamidian massacres, which were between 1894, 1896. Then we had the Adana massacre, which was in 1909. And finally, the genocide, which was 1915 to 1923. Now, let me clarify that currently there is no Armenian living in Cyprus who is fully pre-genocide, who has a fully pre-genocide family, meaning there are people whose mother or father or grandmother or grandfather were in Cyprus before the genocide and the massacres, but there is not any Armenian living nowadays who was fully 100% pre genocide family in Cyprus. The last
Mhm.
one, the last one who was like that was Bedros Yeramian. He died, I think, less than 5 years ago.
And we'll get into the historical migratory patterns of the Armenian community further in a little bit. I just want to talk about the Armenian Cypriot identity is and how you would distinguish it from Armenians from Armenia. Is there a very
Well,
clear one?
first of all, we should clarify that the Armenians are one nation but two people. Those living in Armenia, Georgia, and the former Soviet Union, they're different to the Armenians of the diaspora. They're different in terms of customs. They're different in terms of language. I mean, Armenians in the diaspora, they mostly speak Western Armenian, whereas Armenians in the former Soviet Union, and Iran as well, they mostly speak Eastern Armenian. And the two are very different. Even you can even tell by their faces that, these are from Armenia and these are not from Armenia. So it's a very
Mhm.
diverse diaspora, I would say.
And in Cyprus, are Armenian Cypriots noticeably different by customs or language, like a dialect?
Dialect-wise, there are very few patterns that you can identify, but it has to do with mentality. It has to do with uh, other factors as well. So, I mean, each community of the diaspora has different traits, I would say.
My father, he's from a village that's not too far away from Armenohori. It obviously from a young age, I noticed the connection between the name Armenohori and the Armenian community. What villages across Cyprus were traditionally considered Armenian? I know they're not Armenian today, but which ones can we identify confidently as being places where they settled?
Now, the first Armenians who came, or let's just say those who came during the Byzantine era, settled in Armenochori, Arminu, Kornokipos, Platani, Patriki, Spathariko, maybe even Musere. But all these villages, or at least most of them, were no longer Armenian by the time of the Ottoman era. Because during the Latin era, which was the Frankish era and the Venetian one, they were mostly centered in cities and towns. However, there were also some in Khalevka where the monastery is, and There were also churches in some villages. If memory serves, one of these was Kornokipos, and the other one would have been Platani. Maybe there's a third one. I don't quite recall now. So, I mean, the original villages that they either founded or inhabited were not Armenian until recent times. So there is a gap.
Mhm. You mentioned churches. Do we still see the presence of the Armenian community in the art and architecture and churches around Cyprus?
Well, let's say that the cathedral, currently, I'm talking currently, having in mind the Turkish occupation, because I will speak about the occupied places later. Now, currently, the cathedral is in Nicosia. It's dedicated to the Virgin Mary. There is a church in Larnaca dedicated to Saint Stephen, a church in Limassol dedicated to Saint George, and there are also three chapels in the vicinity of Nicosia. One of them is dedicated to St. Paul, which is near the Lydra Palace Hotel. It's within a cemetery. The other one, which is also within a cemetery, is dedicated to the Holy Resurrection. And the third one is dedicated to the Holy Savior of all, which is within the compound of the Kalajian Rest Home. Now, all of these churches were built. The oldest of these I mentioned is the chapel, which was built in 1892. So all of them, except for that one, they're 20th century buildings. However, in the occupied areas, we have older religious places. The old cathedral, which is also dedicated to the Virgin Mary and is located in occupied Nicosia, was built between 1308 and 1310. The monastery of Saint Macarios was rebuilt in 1425. It was rebuilt, but it was originally established near the year 1000 by Copts, and then it came to the hands of the Armenians. And there is also the Church of Ganchvor, the Virgin Mary of Ganchvor. Ganchvor, it means the caller, the summoner. This was built in 1346 in Old Famagusta. And there is also an Armenian Evangelical Church, which of course now is not in use, which was built between 1946 1947 in occupied Nicosia. But at the time, it wasn't occupied, of course.
You mentioned, we're talking about the different waves of Armenian settlement throughout history. When I was preparing for this episode, I came across, maybe it was an inconsequential quote where you mentioned that there's a possibility that we could even have the very earliest presence of Armenians in from the 5th century BC, and that's not.
Yes.
Yeah, what is that based on? I know it's not.
Um, it's if memory serves, some coins were found. Armenian coins were found from that era, and they were found in Gidium, which is near Larnaca. But this is not conclusive evidence. I mean, maybe somebody brought those coins from somewhere else. It doesn't mean that Armenians were
Right,
here.
right.
So, but for the first conclusive, immigration migration in Cyprus by the Armenians is in 578 because there is written evidence about this. So we
Uh,
consider that to be the beginning.
And in what capacity do they first arrive in Cyprus in in the 6th century?
Now, at the time, Cyprus was under the Byzantines, and one of the things that the Byzantines did was to move populations around the empire in for their own purposes. Now, those Armenians who came to Cyprus, they were mostly they were mercenary soldiers. And the reason why they established those villages that we talked about before was because those villages were in strategic locations. But
Hmm.
then again, the centuries passed, and during the Frankish era, we had different Armenians coming to Cyprus. They came as merchants, they came as nobles. Don't forget that the Kingdom of Cilicia was very much related to the Kingdom of Cyprus. So it was a different story altogether. And there was also intermarriage between the Franks and the Lusinians and the Armenians. And at some point, I mean that was a surprise to me. At some point, Cyprus was controlling parts of Cilicia. If I'm not mistaken, it was the port of Ayas, maybe. Not quite sure about this.
When was the Armenian bishopric established in Nicosia? Because I feel like this is in that uh, period, in the Frankish period, that this happens.
No, it was before prelature, but at the time it was a bishopric. It was established in 973 AD, but there are some gaps in the names of the bishops or prelates that we have. Now, the first name of a bishop that we have is in 1179 because there was a synod in Chromgla. And afterwards, we have another name in 1307 because there was another synod. So there are gaps for the first centuries, but we basically have continuity from 1179, then 1307, afterwards 1340, but then 1421 onwards, we have a complete list.
What kind of stands out is that both under the Byzantines and the Franks, the fact, and you might have to clarify this for me. My understanding is that the Armenian Apostolic Church, rather, it's an
Correct.
Oriental church. How and not in full communion with either the Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Catholic Church. So, how were they allowed to sort of set up their churches in Cyprus?
During the Byzantine era, which was when their uh, bishopric was formed, it was a logical thing, that they would establish their bishopric in Cyprus because, there were quite a few Armenians in Cyprus. We don't know how many. Don't forget that the concept of numbers is a notion of modernity. And during the period in question, we we do not have numbers. I mean, we have many, we have thousands and so on, but we don't know exactly how many. Now, because the prelature was already, the bishopric, excuse me, was already in place when the Latins came, there was no problem. Uh, at some point, there were some bishops, and the bishopric was established in Famagusta as well. That was in the 14th century and the 15th century, and part of the 16th century, at least until Famagusta was seized by the Ottomans.
Yeah, you had mentioned the Byzantines quite often moved entire populations from different parts of the empire to others, and it I realized in reading and preparing again for this episode that John II Komnenos, he
Yeah.
moved the entire village or town of Tel
City of
Hamdun.
Tel Hamdun, yes.
He
Well,
moved it to Cyprus. What for?
it was a common practice. It was a common practice to move people from one place to the other. I mean, even when we study the history of Cyprus, we learn about the metikesia, the moving of the Cypriots to Artaki. Artaki is a place not far from Constantinople, because don't forget that the full title of the Archbishop of Cyprus is what? Archbishop of Nova Justiniana and Old Cyprus. So at school, they teach us that all the population of Cyprus, because of the Arabs, was moved to this place, Artaki. But it wasn't exactly that. It was part of the population that was moved to this place, which was later called Nea Iunstinianoupolis, Nova Justiniana. So it was for a number of reasons that they would move populations. Don't forget that empires are not monolithic, and they're not monolingual and not monoethnic. The moment they become monolingual, monoethnic, and so on, they dissolve.
I have some numbers here. 30,000 moved to Cyprus in 1322, another 30,000 in 1403. If you had to quantify the total population movement of Armenians to Cyprus in the Frankish period, or rather from the late Byzantine or Middle Byzantine to Frankish period, what sort of number would we come up with?
I would not, because don't forget that the sources mention these numbers, but it doesn't mean that the numbers are accurate. Also, don't forget that they came, but not all of them stayed, and others were,
Mhm.
let's just say, assimilated into the local population. That's also the case with the Maronites. I mean, many Greek Cypriots in Cyprus have Maronite roots that they don't know about, or Armenian roots, or Latin roots that they don't know about. So again, we cannot be precise because at the time, people who were contemporary to the period weren't precise because it didn't have to be. The first time that we have actual numbers for Cyprus, not the Armenian community, for Cyprus in general as a population, it was during the Venetian era, because during the Venetian era, Cyprus was basically a colony. And when you're a colony, your rulers, they tax you. And they needed to know how many people were in Cyprus and where they were in order to tax them.
Mhm.
They just, had a total number and the villages and so on.
Yeah, you mentioned mixing with the local population. I was very surprised to read that the Emperor Isaac Komnenos, he actually had married the daughter of an Armenian prince. Was this common? How common did the nobility sort of exchange individuals for marriage?
Don't forget that when you're a king or an emperor or a prince or a duke, you marry into a family and an empire and a kingdom or a dukedom and so on. So everything was done strategically. The Armenians were very good from a military point of view. I mean, they had soldiers that were able to fight. So the Byzantines thought that that would be a good match.
Am I wrong in saying that Armenians were better able to ingratiate themselves into the Cypriot nobility much easier than the Greek-speaking population of Cyprus during the Frankish period?
Possibly, because the Armenians had already a kingdom to the north of Cyprus, where Cilicia was. So they were already nobles. I mean, not all of them, obviously, but they did have their own nobility. But this came at a cost. We know that because of their connection with the Lusignans, many Armenians became Catholics. Even some kings, they were Latinophiles. So this came at a cost to the
Now
Armenian
you
identity.
now you write that the Armenian community was at its height in the 15th century. In what way was this in terms of population or its economic presence?
I would say both, but again, I cannot give you numbers. So because after the 15th century, we have in 1489 we have Venice taking over after machinations. They took over Cyprus and they turned it into a colony. Now, this had a severe impact in Cyprus, coupled with natural disasters. There were earthquakes, there were droughts, there were other things. So, Cyprus as a whole suffered during the Venetian era, not only because of the Venetians. Therefore, after 1489, things went south, I would say. And I mean, we even know that the Church of Famagusta wasn't used for most of the Venetian era. This we know from sources, which means that people left Cyprus. Armenians left Cyprus.
Now, under the Ottomans, I read that the Armenians in Famagusta were expelled while Armenians in Lefkosia flourished and the population grew. What
Yeah.
accounts for this disparity?
First of all, bear in mind that when the Ottomans came, they first took over Nicosia and then they took over Famagusta. Famagusta was under siege for 9 months, and this came at a cost for the Ottomans. As a result, when they took over Famagusta, they expelled all the local population that they hadn't massacred. So Famagusta was a forbidden town, let's say, a forbidden city for non-Muslims. It wasn't just the Armenians; it was the whole population, the Christian population, of course, and even the Christians who were allowed to enter, most of whom were foreigners, they couldn't ride a horse within the walls. And don't forget, why was Varosha established? Because they had to leave. They were ousted from Famagusta, and they established Varosha to the south of it.
That's an interesting fact that I was not aware of. At the start of this interview, you mentioned that the bulk of modern day Armenian Cypriots really trace themselves to the 20th century. But there was also a period of, I suppose, we could use the word mass exodus out of Cyprus, also in the 20th century. What contributes to that population movement in the opposite direction?
During the Oka emergency, there was a period of unrest in Cyprus. And there were those who also felt that the British were their protectors, which they were actually. So some of them left Cyprus to go to places like the UK, Canada, Australia, and other places. Now, when the Republic was established in 1960, there were about exactly actually 3,628 Armenians. However, uh, during the 1960s, there was this movement of repatriation. This was a pan-Armenian phenomenon, and it was called in Armenian it was called nerkacht, which means to return back, not to go back. Now, for Cyprus, this happened in 1962, 63, and 64. And there were 576 Armenian Cypriots who chose to leave Cyprus to go to Armenia. There was, it's a very bitter story for all Armenians, not just the ones in Cyprus. There was massive propaganda at the time. The Soviets were trying to paint Armenia as their final destination and their ultimate destination, and they were given the wrong impression, let's say, as to how life was in the Soviet Union. They regretted it, needless to say. And starting from the late 60s, they would return to Cyprus, but most of them returned, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of socialism.
What sort of impact has the Armenian community in Cyprus had on Cypriot culture in throughout the last century? I noticed that the first cinema that was opened in Cyprus, I believe it was an Armenian who opened
Yeah,
that.
his name was Nigorosyan. Don't quite recall the first name. I think his name was Vahe, but I'm not quite sure of this. Well, the Armenians who came during the genocide, they came from places that they were more evolved, let's say. So they brought with them some arts, some crafts. They brought things that we take for granted today. For example, basturma or gyros and other things. There were quite a few photographers. The number of photographers in Cyprus was not very large one, but there was a disproportionate representation of Armenians amongst them. So many of them were photographers. Um, Currently, there are two uh, Armenian families that they still deal with photography. It's the Mangoyans, who are in Nicosia, and the Voskericians, who are in Limassol. But during the British era, there were quite a few photographers. And also Armenians from the Middle East who came to Cyprus, starting from the late 1940s onwards. They brought things we now take for granted. For example, lahmacun. Lahmacun is not Armenian. Lahmacun is Middle Eastern. Lahem bajun. It means lahem is meat and bajun is dough, if I'm not mistaken. But the recipe we have is Armenian. And later on, they've brought with them um, things like the Armenian dancing, which is also important, and some handicrafts that they did, especially Marashi cords and Aintabi cords. These are handicrafts, different types of handicrafts, and other things as well.
If people wanted to learn more about the Armenian community in Cyprus, where could they look to find out more, to get more information?
Now, modesty aside, they can just Google me because I've made sure that most of my works are online. There is a booklet by the PAO, which is called the Armenians of Cyprus. This booklet is available in English and also in Greek, different. I mean, it's the same content, but different publications. There are also many articles I've written and other books, Of course, others have also written about the community, not just myself. One book that I would definitely recommend is a book by Susan Patty, which is called Faith in History. This book was published in 1997, and it's basically her thesis. She did field work in Cyprus during the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
And it's not a historical book, but it's social anthropology, so also interesting. Now,
Well, I commend you for the work that you're doing, and do
thank you.
yeah, keep it up. And it was a pleasure having this conversation and learning more about a community that I and presumably others like me don't know much about in Cyprus. And this is just I suppose a first step. So thank you so much for coming on to the podcast.
Indeed, not many people know about the Armenians. I mean, hopefully, and that's what I see now, more people know about the Armenians.